The setting sun drenched the Montana riverbank in gold as Katherine King's tears fell into the rushing waters, each droplet carrying away pieces of her shattered dreams, while the letter that had destroyed her world lay crumpled in her trembling hand. Montana Territory, 1876. Katherine had ridden for hours, desperate to escape the suffocating walls of her family's homestead and the devastating news contained in that single sheet of paper. Her chestnut mare grazed peacefully nearby, unconcerned with human sorrows as Katherine's body shook with each sob. The river's constant flow matched the steady stream of her tears, offering no comfort but at least drowning out the sound of her grief. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats over her crying, nor did she notice the tall figure dismounting from a dappled gray stallion several yards away. It wasn't until a shadow fell across her that Katherine realized she was no longer alone. "Madam, are you hurt?" The voice was deep and gentle, tinged with concern. Katherine didn't look up, too embarrassed by her tear-streaked face and too lost in her sorrow to acknowledge the stranger. "Please, just leave me be." Instead of retreating, the man crouched down beside her. His spurs jingled softly as he settled onto one knee, keeping a respectful distance but close enough that she could smell leather and pine on him. "I don't make a habit of leaving ladies in distress," he said, "especially not with night coming on." When Katherine still refused to lift her gaze, a weathered hand appeared in her field of vision, gently tilting her chin upward. She found herself looking into eyes the color of a summer sky set in a sun-bronzed face beneath a well-worn Stetson. "There now, precious," he said softly, his voice warming the word into something sacred. "Whatever's troubling you can't be worth all these tears." Katherine blinked, momentarily forgetting her grief in her surprise at the endearment from a complete stranger. The man was perhaps 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun and a kindness in his expression that seemed genuine. "You don't know that," she whispered, pulling her face away from his touch. He nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, I don't." He settled more comfortably on the riverbank beside her, though keeping a proper distance. "Name's Ethan Lawson. I've got nowhere particular to be tonight, so I can sit here as long as you need." Katherine wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "Katherine King." "And I don't need a stranger's company." "Fair enough, Miss King." He tipped his hat but made no move to leave. "But these parts aren't safe for a woman alone, especially come nightfall. I can escort you home when you're ready." Katherine glanced at the crumpled letter in her hand, fresh tears threatening. "I have no home to return to, not anymore." Ethan's expression shifted to one of quiet concern. "Would you care to explain? Sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter." Something in his steady gaze made Katherine want to trust him, despite her better judgment. Perhaps it was simply that she had no one else to tell. "My father is dead," she said, her voice breaking on the final word. "This letter came today. He was working at a mine in Colorado." "There was an accident." She handed him the crumpled paper. "The company sent a month's wages as compensation." Ethan carefully smoothed the letter and read it, his jaw tightening. "Montana Mining Corporation," he muttered, "known for cutting corners on safety." He looked up at her. "I'm truly sorry, Miss King." "Father went there to earn enough to save our farm," Katherine continued, gesturing vaguely in the direction of her homestead. "The bank's threatening foreclosure. Mother died 2 years ago. It's just me now and without Father's earnings." She trailed off, the reality of her situation overwhelming her once more. Ethan handed the letter back, his expression thoughtful. "When's the foreclosure due?" 2 weeks, Katherine whispered. "I don't know the first thing about running a farm on my own, let alone saving it." The sun had dipped below the horizon now, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple. Ethan stood and offered his hand. "Miss King, I can't solve your problems, but I can at least see you safely home and perhaps offer some advice if you'll permit it." Katherine hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and reassuring as he helped her to her feet. "I've worked plenty of farms," he said as they walked to their horses. "And I know a thing or two about dealing with banks. At the very least, I can help you consider your options." Katherine studied him in the fading light as he helped her mount her mare. "Why would you help me, Mr. Lawson? You don't know me." Ethan swung into his saddle with practiced ease. My pa raised me to believe that a man's measure is taken by how he treats those who can offer him nothing in return. He smiled slightly. Besides, I've been drifting too long. Might do me good to stay in one place for a spell. As they rode side by side through the gathering darkness, Katherine felt the first tentative stirrings of hope. Her grief was still raw, her future uncertain, but somehow the presence of this stranger made her feel less alone. The King homestead came into view as they crested a gentle hill, a small cabin with a barn and corral, surrounded by fields that had seen better days. In the moonlight, it looked lonely and neglected. "It's not much," Katherine said softly, "but it's all I have left." Ethan surveyed the property with a thoughtful expression. "Good land, just needs the right attention." He turned to her. "Miss King, I'd like to make you a proposition." Katherine raised an eyebrow, immediately wary, seeing her expression. Ethan chuckled. "A proper one, I assure you. I'm between jobs at the moment. If you'd provide room and board, I'd work your land and help you get this place profitable again. No wages needed until harvest time." "Why would you do that?" Katherine asked, dismounting at the hitching post. "Because I've been where you are," Ethan said simply, swinging down from his horse. "Lost my own folks' ranch in Kansas after they died. No one stepped up to help me then. I've regretted it ever since, watching another family move into our home." Katherine lit a lamp inside the cabin, illuminating the sparse but tidy interior. She gestured for Ethan to sit at the kitchen table while she put on coffee. "I can't pay you," she said, her back to him as she worked. "And there's no guarantee we'll save the farm." "I understand that," Ethan replied, "but I'd rather try and fail than ride away knowing I did nothing." Katherine turned to face him, studying his open expression. Everything she'd been taught warned against trusting a stranger so quickly, yet something told her Ethan Lawson was a man of his word. "The barn has a small room where Pa's hired hands used to stay," she said finally. "It's yours if you want it." Ethan smiled, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. "I'll start at first light." True to his word, Ethan was already working when Katherine emerged from the cabin the next morning. He had the plow hitched to her old draft horse and was turning the soil in the largest field, preparing it for a late planting. Over the next few days, a rhythm developed between them. Ethan worked from dawn till dusk, pausing only for the meals Katherine prepared. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, discussing what needed to be done and occasionally sharing stories of their lives. Katherine learned that Ethan had been a ranch hand, a cavalry scout, and briefly a deputy in a small Kansas town before drifting to Montana. He was educated, having attended 2 years at a college back east before family troubles called him home. In turn, she told him about growing up on this homestead, about her mother's illness that had drained the family's savings, and her father's desperate decision to seek work in the mines. "Pa always said this land would provide for us," she said one evening, a week after Ethan's arrival. But the last few seasons brought drought, then floods. Nothing went right. Ethan nodded, looking out over the fields where green shoots were already pushing through the soil. "Land's got a way of testing you, seeing if you're worthy of its bounty." He glanced at her. "You're tougher than you look, Miss King." "Katherine," she corrected him. "After all this time, I think you can use my given name." He smiled. "Katherine it is, and I'm Ethan." The next day, they rode into town together to speak with the bank manager. Katherine felt a flutter of anxiety as they tied their horses outside the imposing brick building. "Let me do the talking," Ethan said quietly as they entered. The bank manager, Mr. Tulliver, was a portly man with small, calculating eyes. He smiled thinly when they entered his office. "Miss King," he said, not bothering to stand. "I was beginning to think you'd abandoned the property already." "No, sir," Katherine replied. "I've come to discuss an extension on our loan." Tulliver's expression hardened. "I'm afraid that's impossible." "Your father's death, while regrettable, doesn't change the fact that the loan is severely delinquent." Ethan stepped forward. "Mr. Tulliver, I'm Ethan Lawson. I'm working with Miss King to bring the farm back to productivity." "And you are?" Tulliver raised an eyebrow. "A concerned party," Ethan replied smoothly. I believe it would be in the bank's interest to grant an extension until harvest time. The wheat we've planted will yield a good crop enough to make a substantial payment on the loan. Tulliver leaned back in his chair. Mr. Lawson, I'm a businessman. The King property is prime land that could be sold to the railroad for a handsome sum. Why would I wait for an uncertain harvest? Because, Ethan said, placing his hands on the desk and leaning forward slightly, I'm personally guaranteeing that payment. And I have friends at the territorial newspaper who would be very interested to hear how the bank is eager to seize a widow's property barely a week after she learned of her husband's death. Katherine glanced at Ethan in surprise. Her father hadn't been her husband, but the implication was clear and effective. Tulliver's face reddened. That would be a gross mischaracterization, he sputtered. Ethan straightened. Perhaps, but public sentiment is a powerful thing, especially with elections coming up. Your board members might not appreciate the attention. After several tense moments, Tulliver sighed. Very well, an extension until September 1st, but not a day more, and I'll need 20% of the outstanding balance as a show of good faith. 10%, Ethan countered, paid today. Tulliver nodded curtly. Acceptable. Outside the bank, Katherine stared at Ethan in amazement. How did you do that? And where will we get 10% of the loan balance? Ethan reached into his vest and pulled out a small leather pouch. I've been saving for a while. Consider it an investment in our partnership. Ethan, I can't accept. You can, he interrupted gently. And you will. We're in this together now, Katherine. She searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity there. I'll pay you back, every cent. I know you will, he replied with a smile. Now let's get supplies while we're in town. We've got a farm to save. The weeks that followed were filled with backbreaking work and cautious hope. Ethan repaired fences, tended the crops, and traded labor with neighboring farms to secure help when needed. Katherine took over the vegetable garden, cared for the chickens and milk cow, and kept the house running. In the evenings. Exhausted but satisfied, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular colors. Sometimes they talked, other times they simply enjoyed a companionable silence. One such evening, nearly a month after Ethan's arrival, Katherine found herself studying his profile as he gazed out at the wheat fields, now knee-high and promising. What will you do after harvest? She asked suddenly. When the farm is secure, Ethan turned to her, his expression thoughtful. I haven't thought that far ahead. What would you like me to do? The question caught her off guard. I don't know. I suppose I assumed you'd move on. Isn't that what you do? It was, he admitted. But I've found something here I haven't had in a long time. What's that? Purpose, he said simply, and good company. Katherine felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Over the past weeks, her grief had gradually given way to something else, an appreciation for Ethan's steady presence, his quiet strength, and the way he treated her as an equal partner rather than a helpless woman. I've grown accustomed to having you around, she confessed softly. Before Ethan could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. 3 men on horseback came into view, and Katherine felt Ethan tense beside her. Evening, folks, called the lead rider, a burly man with a pockmarked face. This the King place. Ethan stood, positioning himself slightly in front of Katherine. It is. Can we help you? The man dismounted, followed by his companions. Name's Silas Reeves. I work for the Montana Mining Corporation. He eyed the property. Fine piece of land you got here. Katherine rose to stand beside Ethan. What do you want, Mr. Reeves? Well, madam, I'm here about your father's accident. Company sent me to make sure the family was taken care of. Something in his tone made the words sound like a threat. We received compensation, Katherine said stiffly. Such as it was. Reeves smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Yes, well, there's been some question about the circumstances of your father's death. Company wants to make sure there are no misunderstandings. Ethan's voice was dangerously calm. What kind of misunderstandings? Just rumors, Reeves said with a shrug. Some folks saying the collapse wasn't an accident, that your pa was asking too many questions about safety violations. He looked directly at Katherine. Companies willing to offer additional compensation. in exchange for your signature on some papers stating you won't pursue any claims. Katherine felt cold dread settle in her stomach. Are you saying my father was murdered? Now, I wouldn't go that far, Reeves said quickly. Just that sometimes accidents happen to troublemakers. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. $500, more than fair considering. Ethan took a step forward. Miss King isn't signing anything, and I think you'd better leave. Reeves's friendly demeanor vanished. This isn't your business, Cowboy. The lady will make her own decision. I already have, Katherine said firmly. I won't be bought off. If my father was killed because he spoke up about unsafe conditions, others should know. Reeves's face darkened. That would be unwise, madam, very unwise indeed. He nodded to his companions, who spread out slightly. We'd hate to see something happen to this fine property. Fires start so easily this time of year. Ethan moved with startling speed, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. That sounded an awful lot like a threat, Reeves. The tension was broken by the sound of more approaching riders. 5 men on horseback appeared, led by a gray-haired man wearing a sheriff's badge. Everything all right here, Miss King? The sheriff called out. Katherine had never been so relieved to see Sheriff Taylor, who had been a friend of her father's. These men were just leaving, Sheriff, she replied. Reeves glared at Ethan before backing toward his horse. This isn't over. I believe it is, Sheriff Taylor said, dismounting. Mr. Reeves, I've been wanting to speak with you about certain allegations regarding the Montana Mining Corporation. Why don't you and your friends ride with me back to town? As the sheriff escorted Reeves and his men away, Katherine turned to Ethan, her hands trembling. My father, they killed him. Ethan took her hands in his. We don't know that for certain, but we'll find out the truth, I promise you. That night, Katherine couldn't sleep. The revelation about her father's death had reopened wounds she thought were beginning to heal. Around midnight, she gave up trying to rest and went to sit on the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cool night air. She wasn't surprised when, a few minutes later, the barn door opened and Ethan emerged, clearly having noticed the light from her lamp. He crossed the yard and joined her on the porch steps without a word. I keep thinking about his last letter, Katherine said after a while. He mentioned unsafe conditions, timbers that weren't properly secured. I thought he was just complaining, but he was trying to warn someone. Ethan nodded. Men like Reeves, they value profit over human lives. Your father must have been a man of principle. He was, Katherine whispered. And now I don't even know if I can give him justice. Ethan tentatively placed an arm around her shoulders. We'll find a way. Sheriff Taylor's a good man. And there must be other miners who knew your father who might be willing to speak up. Katherine leaned into his embrace, drawing comfort from his strength. Thank you, Ethan, for everything. He looked down at her, his expression softening. Katherine, I need to tell you something. She met his gaze questioningly. I wasn't entirely honest about why I stopped that day by the river, he admitted. I'd been watching your farm for a few days, thinking about asking for work. I'd heard in town that your father was away at the mines. Katherine stiffened slightly. You were spying on me. Not spying, he corrected quickly. Just observing. I saw how hard you were working alone, and I admired your determination. When I saw you ride out that afternoon, I followed at a distance, concerned you might be in trouble. So finding me crying was convenient. Katherine asked, pulling away slightly. Ethan sighed. It wasn't like that. When I saw your grief, all thoughts of asking for work vanished. I just wanted to help. He met her eyes directly. Everything since has been genuine, Katherine. My concern, my help, my... He hesitated. Your what? She prompted softly. My feelings for you, he finished, which have grown stronger every day. Katherine's heart raced at his confession. She had been fighting her own growing attraction, telling herself it was merely gratitude or the result of their forced proximity. Ethan, her words were cut off by the crack of a rifle and the splintering of wood near their heads. Ethan reacted instantly, pushing Katherine down and covering her body with his own as another shot rang out. Inside. He hissed, half dragging her through the door before slamming it shut behind them. Katherine crawled to the window, staying low. Reeves, most likely, Ethan agreed, retrieving his rifle from where he'd left it earlier. Stay down and away from the windows. More shots peppered the cabin, sending splinters flying. Catherine's mind raced with fear, not just for herself but for Ethan, who was risking his life for her. Ethan moved to another window, carefully peering out. I count 3 of them spread out along the tree line. He looked back at her, his expression grim. They're probably hoping to scare us enough that you'll sign their papers, or worse. What do we do? Catherine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Ethan considered for a moment. The sheriff said he'd send a deputy to check on us in the morning. We just need to hold out till then. For the next hour, they huddled in the cabin as occasional shots rang out, carefully timed to keep them on edge without wasting ammunition. Ethan returned fire sparingly, more to keep their attackers at a distance than with any real hope of hitting them in the darkness. During a lull in the shooting, Ethan crawled over to where Catherine was pressed against the wall. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her face was pale with fear. "I never thought they'd go this far. Men like Reeves don't like being defied," Ethan said grimly, "especially not by a woman." Another shot hit the cabin, this one passing through the window and embedding itself in the far wall. Catherine flinched but held her composure. "You know," she said with a weak attempt at humor, "this isn't how I imagined our conversation going." Ethan smiled despite the tension. "No, how did you imagine it, with less gunfire, for one thing?" She hesitated, then reached for his hand. "And with me telling you that I share your feelings." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, then softened as he squeezed her hand. "Not exactly the romantic setting I'd have chosen for this discussion. Beggars can't be choosers, Mr. Lawson," she replied with a small smile. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching, followed by shouts and more gunfire, but this time not directed at the cabin. They heard Sheriff Taylor's voice calling out, ordering Reeves and his men to drop their weapons. When silence fell, Ethan cautiously approached the window. "It's the sheriff," he confirmed, "and looks like he brought half the town with him." They emerged from the cabin to find Sheriff Taylor and several armed townsmen standing over Reeves and his companions, who were now disarmed and kneeling with their hands behind their heads. "Miss King, Mr. Lawson," the sheriff greeted them. "Sorry we cut it a bit close. Got word from one of the miners who worked with your pa that Reeves might try something like this." Catherine stepped forward. "Is it true, Sheriff, about my father?" Sheriff Taylor nodded gravely. "Got sworn statements from 3 miners who say your pa was warning about unsafe conditions. Day after he threatened to go to the territorial governor, there was a collapse in the section where only he was working." He glanced at Reeves. "These fellas were sent to make sure you didn't cause similar troubles." "You'll hang for this," Reeves snarled. "Perhaps," the sheriff replied calmly, "but not before you tell us everything about who gave the orders." As Reeves and his men were led away, Catherine felt a strange sense of closure. It wouldn't bring her father back, but at least his death wouldn't go unpunished. Ethan stood beside her, watching the riders disappear down the road. "You'll need to testify," he said softly. "I know," she replied. "Will you come with me?" He turned to face her fully. "Catherine, I'll go wherever you want me to go." In the growing light of dawn, with neighbors and friends milling around the yard, Catherine did something impulsive. She stood on tiptoe and pressed a kiss to Ethan's cheek. "Then stay," she whispered. "Not just until harvest, stay for good." His eyes searched hers, looking for any sign of hesitation or confusion. Finding none, he smiled, a true, unreserved smile that transformed his weathered face. "Yes, madam," he said softly. "I believe I will." The trial of Silas Reeves and the senior officials of the Montana Mining Corporation became the talk of the territory. Catherine's testimony, along with that of the miners who had worked with her father, painted a damning picture of corporate greed and callous disregard for human life. When the verdict came guilty on all counts, Catherine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She and Ethan celebrated quietly that evening, sitting on their porch swing as the first stars appeared. "Your father would be proud," Ethan said, his arm around her shoulders. "I think he would have liked you," Catherine replied, leaning against him, "though he might have objected to how quickly things developed between us." Ethan chuckled. 6 months isn't so quick. Some folks around here court for half that time before marrying." Catherine looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. Is that a proposal, Mr. Lawson? He met her gaze steadily. It is if you want it to be, she pretended to consider. Well, the farm is doing well, the bank loan is nearly paid off. I suppose I could do worse than a partner who's already proven his worth. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Is that a yes, Miss King? In answer, Katherine kissed him properly this time, her arms sliding around his neck. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, she smiled. Yes, Ethan Lawson. That's a yes. They were married that autumn, after the harvest was in a bountiful one that paid off the remainder of the bank loan with money to spare. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by neighbors and the miners who had become friends during the trial. As they danced under lantern light in the barn, Ethan pulled Katherine close. Happy, Mrs. Lawson, she smiled up at him, remembering that first day by the river when he had lifted her chin and called her precious, a moment that seemed both a lifetime ago and just yesterday. More than I ever thought possible, she replied honestly. As the years passed, the King Lawson farm prospered. They added a proper bedroom to the cabin, then another when their first child arrived, a daughter they named after Katherine's mother. A son followed 2 years later with Ethan's father's name. The Montana Mining Corporation was dissolved following the trial, its assets seized and distributed among the families of miners who had died in preventable accidents. Katherine used her portion to establish a small school on the edge of their property, where she taught the children of neighboring farms and ranches. Ethan expanded their operations, adding cattle and horses to their wheat farming. His reputation for fair dealing and hard work spread throughout the territory, bringing offers of partnership and investment that allowed them to purchase adjacent properties when they became available. 10 years after that fateful day by the river, Katherine and Ethan stood on their porch, watching their children playing in the yard with the family dog. The homestead had grown into a proper ranch house, surrounded by well-tended fields and healthy livestock. Did you ever imagine this? Katherine asked, leaning against her husband's solid frame. That day when you found me crying, Ethan's arm tightened around her waist. I hoped, he admitted. Even then, something told me you were special, worth staying for. Katherine thought about the journey they'd taken together from grief and desperation to love and prosperity. There had been hardships along the way, drought years, cattle disease, the time Ethan had been thrown from a horse and spent weeks recovering. But through it all, they had faced each challenge together. You called me precious that first day, she recalled. It seemed so strange coming from a stranger. Ethan smiled down at her, the lines around his eyes deeper now but still crinkling with warmth when he looked at her. It just came out, but I meant it then and I mean it now. He kissed her forehead gently. You are precious, Katherine, you and the life we've built. As the sun set over their land, painting the Montana sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold, Katherine silently thanked the river where she had once sat crying, the place where her ending had become a beginning, where loss had ultimately led to love. I love you, Ethan Lawson, she said simply. His blue eyes, still as clear and honest as the day they met, shone with answering devotion. And I love you, Katherine Lawson, yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows.